Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now behind me is the city of London, the financial hub of Britain. And in the hot summer of 1720 it was also still the financial hub, but a crisis was looming. A huge mania of buying and selling shares had created a massive bubble, which then of course burst. This was the famous South Sea bubble. So join me now as I have a look around at the causes of this mania, the consequences and significance of it all, and ultimately, why did it happen? Behind me, of course, is the Bank of England, which was created in 1694. So by the time of the South Sea Bubble, 1720, it's sort of a generation old, very new institution. And this is a good place to talk about the financial situation in the 1720s. And it can be summed up with two things, really. One is government debt, and one is a new financial market. London is a new place for finance. Let's start on the war debt. Well, the main reason why the government is in debt is, of course, war, that age-old reason. This one was the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714. And it was a brutal, long war against the French and the Spanish, and Britain was in debt for about £50 million, which in the 1720s is an astronomical amount of money. So the government needs to raise money, and needs to raise money pretty fast. Now, one option, of course, is to raise taxes, not very popular, but there is a new fangled thing they got up their sleeve, a new plan, which is to sell government bonds. Now, this isn't Mr. C economics, so I don't want to get too much into this, but imagine that government bonds are IOUs. The government's got all this debt, it's going to sell an IOU to somebody else to buy that debt off them. Now, why would somebody buy debt? Well, the government say, well, we will pay you back over several years maybe, and we'll give you interest, we'll give you a little bit more. So it's a win-win. The government gets their debt paid for, and the investors who bought those bonds will get their money back, plus a little extra. What a win-win. By the way, if any of this sounds dodgy at all or built on sand, that's because it is. Now, the other thing I mentioned here was a new emerging financial market. The Bank of England is a good example of that, only created in 1694, just 20 years before this. And there's an emerging middle class, there are sort of people who have not all landed gentry, merchants, etc., who now have quite a lot of money. And crucially, there's very little regulation, no one's stopping anything, no rules are in there, so there's lots of money swishing around. So put those two together. The government needs to raise money fast. What it needs a new established company to come in and buy all these government bonds to pay off the debt. Win-win. This is the corner of Threadneedle Street and Bishopgate, and just behind me there was the headquarters of the South Sea Company, set up in 1711. Now, there was a big fire in the 19th century, not much of it exists apart from the sort of little tiny middle section, and there's still an interesting frieze on the top there with some very smug looking people surrounded by boats and the map of the world. Anyway, as I was saying, this was the location of the South Sea Company. This was created by a man called Robert Harley. Now, he is not called Prime Minister or considered Prime Minister, but to all intents and purposes, he was. He was the Lord Treasurer, and actually the person who replaced him afterwards was Robert Walpole, who is considered the first Prime Minister. So Robert Harley perhaps misses out on that name. But anyway, he was a Tory, and he was annoyed that the opposing party of his, the Whigs, they controlled the Bank of England, and they controlled the East India Company, another huge trading company. So he wanted to take away a bit of that Whig power. So he created this institution. It also must be mentioned at the moment that this was the rise of the political class as well, because the monarch at the time, well, there were actually two. Queen Anne, she died in 1714, and basically the end of her life she was not too concentrated on dying and being rather ill. And then the new king, George I, he couldn't speak English. So perhaps this is a reason why there's a rising political class as well. But anyway, the South Sea Company is set up on the idea of buying this government debt, and it says it's going to be fine because it's going to pay for all of that with the untold wealth of the South American lands of gold and jewels and all the trade that can come from South America. It's going to be wonderful. There's a big problem. It's all based on nothing, based on nonsense. pure speculation. Why? Because Spain controlled South America, Britain didn't, so the South Sea Company couldn't get anywhere near any of that gold or any of those commodities. It could do a bit of trading in slaves, but again, the Spanish controlled the slave trade there, so it's all based on nothing. But anyway, it doesn't matter, does it? Who cares about a little bit of truth, a little bit of inconvenience? That doesn't matter. Let's just go, make speculation, and say to everyone, this is going to be amazing. Throughout the city of London, there's lots of these little alleyways all around the place, very labyrinthine and dark. Quite quiet nowadays, but in the 1720s it was a real hub of activity here, mainly because of many of the coffee houses. This one in particular is called Cowper's Court, and that was home to one of the two biggest coffee houses, one called Jonathan's and the other one called Garraway's. And indeed, if you come here today, on the floor there's a little plaque which has got information about that, and it's actually got a little image of some men who are drinking coffee and smoking, etc. Rather interesting. Now, what were these all about? These were the social media of the day. This is where you would go along. Oh, sorry, getting very dark here now. You would go along here and you would trade your stock. You would talk about, this is the great next company you should definitely invest in. Have your coffee, newly getting imported in from South America, interestingly. And you would say, you must invest in this, I'll do it, all that stuff. And speculation will grow wild. Thousands of people got involved in it. From the highest in society, Isaac Newton spent £20,000 worth of money to buy stocks and shares, right to the lowly people. Servants were selling their positions, prostitutes in the streets as well also bought many stocks and shares. Everybody was in on it. I finished here actually at Simpson's, which sadly is closed now, and it doesn't quite date from the period, but this is one of the best places you can see for what it might have been like at the time. But anyway, people were remortgaging their houses, they were selling their possessions, they were taking on loans just to get in on it. You've got to be in it to win it. This bubble is growing, it's huge. From stocks and shares that were about £100 overnight now would be worth £1,000. Amazing. This bubble is now huge. Surely it's not going to burst. Just a side note, there were actually quite a few women who invested. About 20% of investors were women. So yes, it was a lot of men in coffee houses buying and selling, but there were quite a lot of women. Indeed, the Duchess of Marlborough was one of the biggest investors in the South Sea Company of them all, which is rather interesting. So it's not totally a tale of men and their avarice. But what's interesting, when the bubble then bursts, a lot of people started to blame women. It was all because of the women, the sexist tropes at the time. This is the Royal Exchange, which was a more formal place where trade was made, and in there would be more career professional traders. And by the end of the summer of 1720, they would have been getting quite suspicious. They would have used the phrase overheating. The market was overheating for all these stocks and shares of the South Sea bubble, and so the panic starts to set in. It all starts to crumble. Why does it start to crumble? Well, I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? It's built on nothing, so it was doomed to fail anyway. But there are some key other factors that come in. One is a lot of the foreigners, the foreign investment from France, etc., they pulled out. They thought, this is dodge, I'm going to move my money somewhere else. Bad news. Also, the government starts to think, I'm not so sure about all this. Maybe we should bring in a bit of regulation, some rules, etc., kind of stop some of the smaller parties. Not so good. And then ultimately, the trigger to this all, panic. A bit like the mania that caused everybody to buy, there's now a mania that causes everybody to sell, and those shares, which are suddenly worth £1,000, overnight, they then be worth about £100. And the panic ensues, the bubble bursts. Now, the real life consequences of this, of course, are people are ruined, people are bankrupt. People had mortgaged their house, they go for them. Landed gentry, very posh, rich people suddenly lose absolutely everything. And indeed, the poorest in society who had invested their tiny amounts, but what to them was huge, they're also now ruined. Thousands of people in London are left in waste and in penury and in bankruptcy from the bubble bursting. So what are the consequences and the significance of all of this? Well, an obvious consequence is a lot of people have been ruined financially. I've highlighted that. But what also it does, it spurs the government into action. It says probably this shouldn't happen again. So it brings in a wave of regulation. Most significantly, the 1720 Bubble Act, which said that companies cannot trade stocks without government approval, essentially creating a stock exchange, a stock market. That act also made sure that politicians couldn't be too involved with these different companies, etc., trying to shut out corruption. The consequence of all this was that now the London financial market was one of the best in Europe. It was one of the strongest, it was the cleanest, it was the most efficient. It suddenly becomes so vibrant. So a great irony there is that this crash, this bubble bursting, this huge financial ruinous thing, is one of the reasons why London is so strong as a financial market today. It created a boom after this. Amazing. But overall, of course, it is a cautionary tale of greed and speculation. And if anybody does come to you and say, I've got you a financial shore, it can never lose, it's almost too good to be true, it probably is. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that as much as I have. Please, as always, let me know what you think, and I'll see you on the next one.